My story is the fact that I served in World War II at a very young age, and I was in high school, needed 6 credits to graduate, and the day I turned 18 was the day I received my draft notice. I wasn't particularly interested in going because I wanted to be a high school graduate. Back in 1943, a high school graduate was a very highly educated person, and that I would have been one of the first in my family to actually have finished high school. But that's my excuse. And then so I drafted me, in less than 3 months I was in the service in the infantry at Fort Benjamin Harrison. And one day I saw a sign that said, if you volunteer to fly, you can be an air cadet. And we'll teach you to be a pilot or a bombardier, or be an officer and a gentleman. Well, of course, I was just 18 and couldn't even drive a car. And I should have caught on to the fact what they really wanted you to do was volunteer to fly and then become a gunner, because the losses were very heavy. And we weren't prepared for World War II. We had to be bombed into it by Japan. Actually, Pearl Harbor may have been a favor, because if we hadn't got into the war when we did, it would have been sad. Because Germany had already conquered most of Europe. They were after England. Japan had conquered most of the Pacific and most of China. I think it's curious today that the people we fought in World War II, Germany and Japan, are now our friends, and the people we protected, Russia and China, are now our enemies. But the world goes around down through the years. I went in at 18, and they trained me, and I was the air cadet. I had my air cadet ring to prove that I was an air cadet. I was a voluntary flight trainee, and the Air Force had one of the most dedicated education programs you ever saw. So they could take green kids right out of high school, teenagers all. They had to drop us to teenagers because we were losing the war. The draft started at age 21 to 35, but they had to drop it to 18. And of course, we were too young to buy a beer, or were too young to drive a car in those days. We didn't have a car anyway, so that was a side point. But once I saw that volunteer to fly, I did it. And I became an air cadet, went to Amarillo, Texas with 40 other guys in August. And they trained us. That's basic training, which means discipline is what you need in basic training, because they put you through the ringer and you jump when they say jump. And so the basic training went fine as an air cadet. But about 2 weeks after I bought my ring, they washed out the entire barracks, because all along they had needed gunners. So at that point, we took aptitude tests. And lo and behold, because a high school teacher had taught us a little basic radio test, I managed to pass for radio school. And so some of the guys didn't pass for anything except being a gunner. They were overseas in probably 6 months. I went to radio school at Sioux Falls, South Dakota, in the dead of winter. I was always in the wrong place at the wrong season. And so after radio school, if you passed that, if you flunked it, then you became a gunner immediately. If you passed it, you stayed up and graduated. And so we became a radio operator, taking 22 words a minute in Morse code. Did-all, did-all, did-all. And then they sent us to gunnery school. And so that was another weather change. We ended up leaving the North Pole at Sioux Falls and going to Yuma, Arizona in the middle of the summer in May. And so in Yuma, Arizona, they gave us a gunnery school for about 3 months. And that was the first time I had seen a B-17. We finally got to ride a B-17. Now, the Air Force had 2 heavy bombers. They had a B-17 and a B-24. And the B-17 was what I wanted. And I had no way of knowing that I would get it. But after gunnery school, they sent us to combat crew training back to Sioux City, Iowa. And we didn't know yet. Yes, we did. We sent us to Lincoln, Nebraska. And Lincoln, Nebraska sent me to Sioux City, Iowa at a B-17 training. The first time I had found out what plane I would actually fly combat on. And so they trained us as combat crew training. I met the other 10 guys for the first time. They were all trained in their specialties. 6 gunners, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier. And then we began to fly. And we did fly for those 3 months, and then it was time to go overseas. We graduated. We were ready to be replacement crews overseas. It turned out that there were 3 of us that were more or less buddies, 3 crews. And so we hung together. And lo and behold, when they sent us over, they kept us together. And we couldn't fly a plane because they had enough planes over there. A lot of planes were fair. A lot of crews got on a plane and flew the Atlantic. We sailed on the Queen Mary. And we sailed alone because the Queen Mary, a former luxury liner, had been converted into a troop ship that could carry about 15,000 men. It happened I was on there with Mickey Rooney and his USO crew. And there were infantrymen and airmen and everything needed to continue the war in Europe. And the Queen Mary was so fast that it could go alone without a convoy. So we left New York Harbor, sailing out into the Atlantic full of German submarines. And Hitler had put a reward on the Queen Mary. Submarine captain that sank the Queen Mary would get the $250,000 and the Iron Cross. He would be a hero. And they didn't get us. We dropped a few depth bombs. I think they were closed a time or 2. But we sailed into Scotland after about 6 days. The coincidence, my life has been full of coincidences. The coincidence here was that I boarded the Queen Mary in New York Harbor on my mother's birthday. And they were playing the Bedford High School song, the Director's March, as I marched up the gangplank. I thought that was a little bit, rubbing it in a little bit too much. It jerked me out of school down to playing my school song. So we went across the 3 crews together on the Queen Mary and landed in Scotland, spent a night or 2 there. They registered us in, and then we got on a little train and took this train across from Scotland down into southern England and Suffolk County, actually, Suffolk Parish County. And we were still together as 3 crews, and we were assigned to the 490th Bomb Group at a little place called I happens to be another coincidence because later our waist gunner got hit on a mission. He got hit in the eye with a steel helmet. It didn't kill him, but the piece of flak that hit him dented the helmet enough to cut his optic nerve. So he lost his eye. So my first book was called Through These Eyes, which I alone know the parody there, is the fact that I was at Orville lost his eye, and I saw the whole thing. So Through These Eyes is my first book. I sent a copy, that was back in 2008 or something, when I first started this business of writing stories about U.S. history, World War II history. I sent that book to Queen Elizabeth, and I sent it to the Royal Palace, but it did get to Sandringham Palace, and I do have a letter back from her lady-in-waiting, which is thanking me for the book, etc., etc. And I have kept the original copy. Someday I'll send it back to. They have a huge museum in London, Duxford. I should say in England, the Duxford American Museum. Someday I'll send that letter back to them. But that's it. I first actually 3 crews were assigned to the 490th Bomb Group at I. And so they wouldn't take us without more training, because all the other pilots who had been flying missions didn't want a bunch of greenhorns flying in their formation. They wanted us trained in formation flying before we joined them. And so we did train for a couple of weeks. And then when we did join them, they put us in the back. Coffin corner on the back tail. That's another story. But so my first mission was December the 5th, and it was Berlin. And my last mission was sometime in April of 45. December the 5th of 44, first mission. In Berlin, the toughest approach you could go. And we flew in the Coffin corner, tail end Charlie, right in the back of the formation, in the low squadron. Now, a formation for defense, a formation was of 36 planes. You had a squadron of 12, and then you had another squadron over here of 12, and then on the low squadron, that 12. So you had them flying in a position where they could drop their bombs at the same time. So pattern bombing or plastering and bombing. So I'm ahead of myself, of course, but once we got to 490th Bomb Group, the officers, of course, went to the officer quarters, and the gunners all went to a Quonset hut someplace. But our 6 gunners ended up in one Quonset hut, and the other crews ended up in different ones. But what they were smart enough to do was put each of us newcomers in with the old veteran gunners who could teach us the ropes and kind of break us into the base. And the first thing we learned was that you continue to do what you're told, and you are going to fly. And if you refuse to fly, you'll be slapped in jail, court-martialed, and end up on permanent KP or something worse than that. And the other rule was you don't salute anybody. And you're here to fly and die. You're not here to go through all the military hoop-de-doo. And I was there almost 9 months, and I think we had about 4 formations, formal formations, to present medals and things. So they meant what they said. You're here to fly. We want you, and keep your standing condition. We want you flying. And of course, the 30 of us were standing there. The 3 crews were standing there that night. I just got off the train. It was dark and cold and Sherlock Holmes kind of atmosphere. And there were 30 of us, of course, and 10 men to a crew. And we had no way of knowing that one crew would be shot down and 3 other guys would be wounded. And it was but that's what happened within 9 months. We had the 50% loss. It was about average for crews. Because one of the big things about flying was the fact that we were in such a hurry to destroy Hitler's defenses. And the way to destroy his defenses was to destroy his supplies. So our targets were always something that would keep him from continuing in his war. So we went after railroads and bridges and so on and so on. Now the reason this happened, you see, early in the war, air crews had to do 25 missions. And most of them only made it to 5 or 10 or 15 before they were shot down. Because the fighters couldn't go with us at that time. Later, they put auxiliary tanks on the fighters, and they could escort you all the way to the target and back. But in the early days of the Memphis Belle, the Germans knew just what the range of the fighter plane was. So they just sat up there in the air and waited. And when our fighters had to turn back, then they hit the bombers. And those guys, all those guys of the early air war, had to fight their way to the target and back to where our planes could go down and refuel and come back up. So it was like checkers or something. But once we did get the fighters with extra fuel tanks, that's a completely different story. And one of my best stories, I think, I'll go ahead. One of my best stories is about a fighter pilot. His son gave me his complete diary. Because the fighter pilots were never where we were. We were based in England, and we flew out of England. They were based in France or Belgium, whatever our ground forces had captured. We recaptured airfields that the Germans had been using, so they could land on the continent and be based on the continent. When our formation formed over England early in the morning, we flew out over the North Sea toward Holland, and our fighters, our protection fighters, the P-51s, the P-47s, the P-38s, would come up from Belgium or someplace and pick us up and protect us before we got into the combat zone. Since the German fighters were based at Amsterdam, the field is still there. I have two granddaughters that have flown into that field. It's still there, Schiphol Airport. But those German fighters were all based there, and they would fly out and meet us. So our fighters had to meet us first and protect us. And so once we entered the combat zone, then that was it all the way in. Drop your bombs and come out. And so my whole deal is my purpose and my goal since I retired as a teacher had been, I played a lot of golf and rode a lot of horses for about 10 years after I retired. But suddenly I had a heart attack in 2000, and and my daughters found my diary, and they said, you got to write a book about this diary. So I did, through these eyes. And then it didn't sell extremely well, but it sold. And so I became sort of captured. I wanted to continue telling our story because people are forgetting it, and they don't teach it in school to any extent whatsoever. I doubt that they even teach the Constitution in school. And so patriotism has driven me to the fact that I want to tell our story and what we had to do as teenagers to protect the world we have today and the world we're giving away today because we're ignoring it, in my point of view. So we set up an interview base over here at the high school, Bedford North Lawrence High School. We had a community station, Channel 14, that we could broadcast over. And so we began interviewing, me and two other people began interviewing all the veterans in Lawrence County. And then we reached out to others. We've had people drive from Bloomington come down, and we've had people come down from Seymour and south, up from the south, just to be interviewed and get their story in a book. And we always gave them a disc of what they said. And I have those discs on file. They're also at the local museum and historical society. But that inspired me again because I got ground guys, there's about infantrymen, a few Navy, and a lot of Air Force. And so all my books are written I've written 6 books on World War II. And they're basically short stories, true short stories by the guy who did the combat. I simply fill in the background and the situation and interpret what they said sometimes. Other times I just print exactly what they said because some of them are excellent. I've got a B-17 pilot who wrote up every mission as soon as he landed, I got a fighter pilot, P-51 pilot, who wrote up every mission when he landed. And I've got an old infantryman who wrote up his entire battles from Bastogne to Berlin, crawling on the ground through the mud and snow and fighting the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was the last big fight we had, and the Air Force became supportive. We became tactical bombers going after the bridges and the supplies and the airfields. We liked to catch German fighters on the ground. And the losses were heavy. I mean, we didn't make a lot of friends. We knew that people might not come back that night. We'd eat breakfast with them, and they might not come back that night. And so that's the way it was. I did 20 missions, and we did another mission that we had to abort and come back, which they counted also. We did a few weather flights, and we did a few practice flights. I got over 400 hours of flight time because since we made lead crew. We made lead crew after 4 missions. And then after we flew a couple more missions, a new bunch of 12 new crews came in. And they asked us to train them. Because we were veterans by now, we'd had 6 missions in. And so I was in the middle of mid-air collision. 2 planes went together and flew everything, And so that was one close call I had. And then the fact that the very first mission, back-tacking to the very first mission was worse than anything because we were tail end Charlie and our plane started acting up and we thought we were going to have to drop out of formation. And once you dropped out of formation, then you were just bait for the German fighters. The procedure was that they had certain rules that were sort of unwritten, but you had to obey them. And one was if you dropped out of formation, you were on your own. The fighters had to stay with the formation. And sometimes they could, depending on where you were, they could help you get down and get to a friendly base. But generally they couldn't. They'd stay right with you. The other rule was if a man was wounded, nobody could do anything about it except just continue the mission. And then Flak was a big thing that everybody feared because it was about a 3-foot tall shell, half shell and half powder, and half slug. And so when they could shoot it up at us into our formations, they had radar and they knew, they could tell our height, our altitude, and so they'd set those fuses on those bombs, on those shells, anti-aircraft shells, to explode at our height, our altitude. And so when they came up there and exploded, just like a shotgun shell, they're just chunks of metal like about the size of your fingers or less, all through the air. And the air was just black with exploding shells, and you wouldn't even see the parts that were going to kill you. But they could damage your plane. They come because the plane was just aluminum, so they come right through. So when we flew, we always we were flying, the altitudes were usually about 25,000 feet. Now when you get above 6,000 or 7,000, you've got to go on oxygen. So one way you could die would be lose your oxygen. And then as you keep going up, it gets colder and colder, and about 40 below zero. So you can freeze to death. Now the protection we had there, of course, were oxygen masks, and there were oxygen tanks at various parts of the plane, so they couldn't, one of them could get hit, and you could still have oxygen in the other positions. And then the heat you had was a wired suit. I keep saying insulated. A wire suit, just like a heating pad, very thin. And when you knew you were going to get a mission, they would tell you, okay, you're on alert, and we'll get you up. And so around 2 or 3 o'clock, they'd get you up. You had your long underwear on, you were sleeping in. You put on your electric suit over that, put on all the heavy equipment, clothing you had, and then Martin charge you on down to the mess hall and eat a real good breakfast. Because they always serve you, on mission days, they serve very good breakfast, fresh eggs and all the best. We always called it our last supper, our last breakfast, because sometimes it was. But you always, from the mess hall, you went to a briefing room. Now the officers, the pilots, and commanders, navigators had different briefings because they had to have different information about the target. And the gunners all went to another briefing, which mainly consisted of telling you where you were going. It had been secret up to then. And then they had to tell you, they'd pull back a map and show you, here it is, and they'd have a line to go, and this is where the Flak is. So on that big map of Germany, they had little blossom signaled little circles, and those were all Flak locations. So the pilots and navigator knew where to fly to avoid it. And we were told simply because if we saw new places, they wanted to make sure we reported it. And so we knew where to expect Flak in our mind. They didn't give us a map, but they just told us about it. And then we had to go out to the equipment shack and get all your equipment and things like your parachute harness and your Mae West jacket and your headsets and earphones and throat mic and all the equipment you're going to need. A lot of it they had it on the plane ahead of time, like our flak jacket, big 45-pound flak jackets, front and back, sort of in a big apron of woven steel covered with cloth. And you put it on and fastened it at your shoulder so you had protection in your stomach and your back. And then you put your parachute harness over that and your Mae West jacket in case you landed in the ocean. It was an inflatable deal, you know, and they call it Mae West because of here. And so once you got in there and got in your position, you had a parachute that was just like a little bundle, and you hook it on your harness, and you didn't move much because you were wearing heavy boots over those heated things. You were wearing the heaviest clothing you had. And so once you got in your position, you just sat and waited till the time to take off. And then every plane, once we made a lead crew, we led out 12 planes. And those 12 planes, once we got up in England, the weather was so bad that you couldn't even see. And they flew on a radio beam and a radio guiding outfit that as long as you could hear that little squeal, you're all right and go up through the clouds. And then once you got into the clear, you had to find the other 11 planes. They had to, and in our case, since we were lead crew, they had to form on us, and they had to find us. So you'd find 3 planes, an element of 3 planes would get together, and then they'd join another 3 planes. They'd always hook them behind us all the way. So 12, 12, and 12. And then that was one of the most dangerous things you could do was to take off and the rendezvous over England, because there were so many collisions that one of my friends that went in ahead of me, he went in the year ahead of me, and he died in one of those collisions over England. And so once you got your group formed, your 12, 12, 12, then you had to go join the rest of the formation and get in with the other 3 squadrons. And so when you sailed out, you had 3 lead planes. Each squadron had a lead plane it took out the ball turret and put in a radar dome so we could see through the clouds. And we could bomb on cloudy days after that. It was a disadvantage, really, because you got to fly more days. And being lead crew, of course, you were always a target, because they knew the command pilots were. The command pilots were in each 12 planes had a command pilot. But the guy in the middle squadron, was the leader of the mission. The low squadron was the one that always got hit by fighters because they come up under so much. But our formation, our bombers always flew just as close together as they could to keep fighters from coming through. Because once they got inside the formation, you couldn't shoot at them because you were shooting at your buddy across on the other side. And so the rumor always went around, it was a fact actually, that the bomb groups that had the tightest formations usually had the least fighter attacks, because the German fighters were looking for easier targets. So besides the collision in the training session, we got hit by flak. The flak just everywhere, you never knew it. And the sad part was, if you avoided all the flak stations all the way to the target, at the target, the sky was just black, and you had to fly into it. And that's when you really learn how to pray, because you know that you may not come out the other side. That flak, those slugs they've killed people, men on the planes, and wounded men on the plane. They destroyed a motor or a prop or part of the plane, or all the gasoline was in the wings, and all that business. So you could be hit at hundreds of places where it would really take you out of the formation. And that's why so many went down. They just couldn't keep up. They lagged behind, and they were unsafe. And the fighters, as I said, the fighters couldn't go back. The fighters had to stay with the main group. So after the collision, on December the 16th, we were flying back from our raid on Stuttgart, Germany, and we didn't know it, but there's a huge snowstorm coming in. And below that snowstorm, Hitler had turned loose 24 divisions of his army, 12 panzer units. And they were in Belgium trying to cut all the way through to cut our forces in half. And that's what happened and we were coming home in that, and we barely made it to the ground before the snowstorm closed the base. But that's when the Battle of Bulge started on December the 16th, and the snow was so heavy and it was the worst winter that Europe had ever had, I guess. And all the equipment was freezing up, and tanks and trucks and everything else would freeze up. And the Germans were better prepared because they knew where they were. They had launched the attack, and they knew better. And that was the story where the Germans went through and changed road signs and everything. So when our boys came in, they were all mixed up, and that's the big story there. Malmedy massacre. A panzer unit captured 100 American men and lined them up in the field and took all their jewelry off of them and turned the machine guns on them at Malmedy. And that was the kind of thing that was driving. That was what they were telling us back in the United States, telling everybody back home, this is another atrocity, another atrocity. Of course, there were atrocities in any war on both sides, but you always tell your side of it. But from December the 16th, there were 10 or 12 days that no airplane could fly because the weather was so bad and Patton was quoted as saying, the weather is working with the Germans. Give us a prayer. And so one of his chaplains made a prayer, and the weather cleared up, and he gave that guy a medal. And that's supposed to be a true story. Patton had to leave. He was in Germany with his 3rd Division and 3rd Army, actually. And then they all had to just quit and head for Bastogne. And I have stories of guys from Bedford who swear that they were pouring gasoline into the tank while it was still running. Jeeps would deliver gas to them, and they'd just grab it and pour it. And so they made it in 24 hours. Patton, one of his generals, got to Bastogne and relieved him. And I think maybe Bastogne had the advantage because they were in the 101st Airborne were inside the buildings and the Germans were outside the buildings, and the weather helped us at that point. But there are a couple of real good stories. Battleground is one, I think, but a couple of real good Bastogne stories. And it was a terrible thing. As I said, John Hill from Medora gave me his complete diary, and I know he told me what happened. And it was that type of thing. On about our 10th mission, our waist gunner got hit. Robbie, and he hit his helmet and cut his eye. I told you that story. And he got down, of course, but the blood froze, and he didn't lose his eye. He just lost the optic nerve. And they had him. I had to go back there and help him get him down and get him wrapped up and keep him from, make sure he was not going to freeze. Then we got back to land, and the snow was still here, and they warned us. Now the snow was coming in. The snow was coming in. Well, the wounded men got to land first. If you had a wounded man, you fired a red flare, and that cleared the air. Everybody had to stay back, and let you land first. But as we looked down, I swear I could see it. There's a snowstorm was just sweeping like a giant broom right across the runways. We couldn't land, and we had a wounded man. And so the radio. I was on the radio, of course, and by that time over England, the pilots could talk on their short radio too. So I wasn't involved with the radio part. They had voice messages by the time over England, and they had about 7 radios on that plane, but mine was the only one that would send Morse code and long distances. Anyway, they said, you got to go to the next base, north of London someplace. So we beat it over there and got down on the ground. And then it snowed for 2 days, and we were there, stuck. Had to take a truck back to our base. And 2 days later, we went back to get our plane. And Robbie was already, we saw Robbie. He was still in the hospital there. That's the last time we saw him. I traced him down, and he's buried someplace in Texas, in the Blue Bonnet Cemetery, someplace in Texas. I sent him a letter one time, but I think he was a little bit older than I was, and I think he was in a nursing home, and somebody else signed for the letter. And then later, my granddaughter found the grave with the tombstone on it. So that's kind of poetic. And so when we made lead crew, they took off our tail gunner, put him on another plane. They put our co-pilot in the tail. The command pilot took his seat. They took off the ball turret gunner and put a radar dome in there in place of the ball turret. The Mickey operator, we call it, the PFF. And that guy, he was 3 or 4 months younger than I was. He got on another crew, and he ended up doing 35 missions and stayed in the Army as a career man. I later met his wife and sisters and at reunions, and his son just has sent me information and etc. He's a friend on Facebook. And after that, I did manage to meet our ball turret gunner, our top turret gunner engineer before he passed away, and I managed to meet our other waist gunner before he passed away. So I do have 3 connections that I know of. Well, on the 10th mission was when Robbie got hit. So we picked up another gunner to replace him. And the only thing I remember about him is that he'd been on a pass and got drunk and missed the train. And so they broke him to private, and we had a private gunner. The thing you had to remember about London, if you went on a pass or anything, that the blackout was in full effect. And so you had to manage your time so that you got on a train that would get you to London, if you were on pass, for instance. And we want to get to London before the subway stopped running. And then you had to get on a subway to get to Piccadilly Circus and the USO clubs and all. They had the Piccadilly Circus. The Rainbow Club was a run by a bunch of English ladies who tried to create America for us. So we had Cokes and hamburgers and et cetera. And it was really nice, and it was very popular. And the countesses and ladies and royal people, semi-royal people, worked there, and for the 4 years, and really it made it nice for us. We could always get a room there. We'd sign up for a room, and they had 2 or 3 motels in the area where we could sleep 50 cents a night or something like that. And so they really made it nice for us. And we toured. I knew London. I probably still would know London better than most American cities, because every time we got a pass, we went to London. A lot of guys wouldn't go because Hitler was bombing it constantly with these V-1 rockets and V-2 rockets. And you'd be sleeping in be an explosion, wake you up, you look out the window and see shells and anti-aircraft fire and all this and that, because they could shoot them down. And there were some English fighter planes that would go up and tip that V-1 rocket and direct it. Now the V-2 was just straight up, straight down, and you'd no protection forever. And London was just a wreck, and people were sleeping in the subways, using them as bomb shelters. And I read the other day where at one instance, the whole neighborhood was down there, because the electric rails were turned off, and of course the lights were off, and everybody just sleeping. But a bomb hit a water main and killed a bunch of them, just swept them out down through there. And I'd never read that before, but the more I dig into this, and the more things I find that are so terrible. And we could take a taxi cab and take a tour of London and see the bombed out places and find places to eat and black market places. And we could see the best places, best theaters. You go to the theater and you'd be sitting there and the bomb would go off and the plaster and dust would fall. I'd shake you up a little bit. Oh, we didn't get any closer than this. But then we went on. We never knew where we were going until that morning, and we had briefing. I mean, it was always a big secret. And I don't think intelligence knew, but intelligence got all the information. After every mission, we had to go back through interrogation and tell where we saw fighters or where we saw Flak the first time, and then they put all that together. And we had already sent, the command pilot would have me send back information. You fly into this target, this black cloud and the minute you come out, somebody has to send back to England what you think happened. So the command pilots would have their radio men send good hit, bad hit, heavy losses, better than average, etc. Any information they could send. And that strike report I sent back. Those guys, the intelligence section, were already planning the next raid or where to go. In other words, if the target was flak was extremely heavy, maybe we pick another area, or etc. But the next big adventure was we couldn't fly for 10 days after December the 16th, so the Bulge was raging and we couldn't do a thing about it. But to me, as soon as the weather cleared, we just cut loose, and no radio, no German railroad station or barge or any factory, etc. Nothing was safe because we were going to hit it. And they said, now you guys can fly 35 missions. So they immediately picked up 10. Every crew had to fly another 10 missions. So that doubled the Air Force, the intensity of what we were doing. And we ended up just destroying all of his fuel. They were the first people that had synthetic oil, etc. And they had whole cities fooling you for the city, where it was. Durban was one of the places. Swinehart and Durban and some of the big tough. The most heavily protected targets were the most important. They actually had flak towers in a lot of the big cities. They built a huge tower, 3 or 4 stories high, and put the guns on top of it, put the anti-aircraft on top of them. And of course, all this was happening when we were bombing in daytime. The British were bombing at night. So we had Germany under 24-hour bombardment. And we just leveled the country, actually. The guys on the ground, the infantrymen would tell us we marched over rubble. Every town we went to was just rubble. And of course that meant that POWs was another great fear, that if you bailed out, if your plane got crippled or damaged, you couldn't make it, the pilot made that determination. He'd ring a bailout bell. And he usually the pilot was always in total command. What he said went, and he could say, all right, you're free to go or you're free to stay with the plane. But the pilot was always trying to make the plane stay up and save it. $275,000 plane. And he was also trying to keep it level so we could get out if we bailed. But if he rang a bailout bell, we know that he knew that we weren't going to make it. But the POW camps, when you bailed out, if you were lucky enough to get out, because once a plane started swirling or going, centrifugal force just plastered you to the wall. And if you got out, it was just by strength alone. So he was always trying to keep his plane straight and give you guys a chance to go. And they could bail through the bomb bay, or I could pull the top hatch on above my radio room. And they had a door in the back. The tail gunner had his own little door. Ball turret gunner had a door, but seldom ever wore his parachute. We didn't have to worry about that. We didn't have a ball turret gunner after the 4th mission. But that's another story that just fascinates people. What in the world happened in that ball? So I got several ball turrets, but I've got so many, at least 3 stories about the ball turret that are very, very interesting, because you learn things that it wasn't as dangerous. It had more armor than most other places. And so as long as everything went well, but if the gears locked and it was pinned in there, that was it. He had to be able to rotate it and point the guns down and climb out his little escape door. It was both. It was his escape door and his way to get it back into the plane. But it was just, the POWs were treated like animals, and they were killed and killed and killed. The Germans, as early as 1938, they had already built a super-duper prisoner of war camp. In 1938, they knew what they were going to do. And they had about 7, maybe 13 prisoners of war camps. And they had this thing about if they captured you, you were never going to get out of there. And so as the war wound down, and we got closer and closer to the POW camps, they took the men out and had a march all over Germany to evade American troops. It was called the Black Bread March. It's about all they had to eat was black bread. And 1,000, maybe 1,000, 2,000 or 3,000 men died on that march. And they all did it. Any time you got close to a POW base. I've got a story. I've got one guy from Bedford who actually helped liberate a camp. And he told what they saw there and what happened, et cetera. And it's bloody. But they had torture chambers, and they had this, and they had that, et cetera. And some of the others were better. Some camps were better than other camps, and it was a completely separate operation. Of course, if you bailed out and the townspeople got you, they'd kill you. So we each had a .45 pistol and holster. I wore mine in Edward G. Robinson style right here. And They told you, said, if you bail out and you make it to the ground, then it's your decision whether you fire at them or surrender. But if the townspeople are coming at you with pitchforks and clubs, I knew I was going to fire, because they hung them. They would capture you and hang you in trees. And one outfit they captured this guy and tied him to a lamppost and beat him to death, and then sent a picture of that back to the bomb group. And they had a very strong POW system as far as that was. If you got captured by the German army, you were safe, because they were instructed to protect you against the townspeople, and they were instructed to bring you to an interrogation camp. And the guy there, 9 times out of 10, had gone to school in America, spoke perfect English, and so they interrogated you there and threw you in solitary and thought you knew more than you did know, and we didn't know anything. We didn't know what was going on. You're only supposed to give your name, rank, and serial number. Well, they took pictures and they documented everything. And they did the same thing in the Jewish concentration camps when they killed all the Jewish people. They actually took pictures of everything they did to prove how effective they were at killing Jews. And there is I always forget the name of the book, but it's available on Facebook. You can read it. At Auschwitz, at one of the camps, the Russians came in and freed the Jews, and they all ran, but one young woman, picked up this diary of an officer, picked up the officer's coat, put it on, and ran out into the cold. But in that coat pocket was a group of pictures that he had taken and showed all the things they had done to these people. And it's on, they have it now. You can look it up if I could think of the name of it. But so that was background for you. And that was the reason when you hoped you never had to bail out. And if you did, while you were going to go, you were going to be captured, hopefully by the Germans. The women, the townspeople, the women wanted a parachute and the men wanted your life. That's the way they put it. But the soldiers would take you to interrogation and you'd end up on a cattle car, standing up next to a bunch of other guys. No room to sit down, no toilet, no water. A couple of days later, you'd end up in a POW camp. And then things got worse. But the officers, the American officers in the camps, organized the men, and they tried their best to follow military rule. And in many cases, the German guards were old people, too old for fighting. And there were some satisfying things in the camps too, I suppose. The worst stories always come out. But we went after about the 13th or 14th mission. We got hit by jet fighters, the Me-262s. But there again, we had a tight formation, and they came in and just zipped past us, and they could go so fast that our P-51s couldn't catch up. But they also went so fast that they couldn't, when they fired their machine guns, they had to vary outweight or they'd overtake their own bullets, shoot themselves down. Now, our P-51 pilots learned how to do, they call it the Luftwaffe stomp. And so when the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force came in, they'd be going, if a P-51 could get behind him, no, he was chasing the P-51. The P-51 would do a loop, and the jet was going so fast he couldn't do that loop, and then the Irish boys could shoot him down. So they had shot down several 262s, and we kept destroying their gas and their oil, and that we attacked their airfields. One mission we went in and shot them on the ground and got the airfield down. And toward the end of the war, those 262s were hiding in the woods and being dragged out to runways with oxen or horses or something, and then take off. But the boats, and then The 262s came in along later, almost toward the end. From December 44 on into 45 and into April, we had our heaviest losses because the Germans were desperate and they were really hitting us. And there was one mission where we lost 4 planes, and then on that mission, one of our buddy crews went down. They all died. They tried to make it back, but they got as far as Holland, and somebody hit them again. Anti-aircraft hit them again, and they died. And there's a side story there that there was a woman. This young man had married a woman, and they had expecting a baby, but he still got sent overseas. So he died without ever seeing his daughter. But the daughter, when she grew up, was determined to find out what happened to him. And the people in Holland are great about history, and they preserve everything, and they have signs where a plane crashed, they have stories, and etc. I received several story backup material, one almost complete story from a guy in Holland. She did the same thing. She found out, she eventually contacted the guy who had been the Salvation Army captain there, the Red Cross captain. He had visited the plane after it crashed. He had helped carry out the bodies. And he gave her all this information, which she gave to me. So I know what happened to that crew. I know that one guy was sick and didn't make it, so he was still alive when they were all gone. That happened quite a bit. Our tailgater told us about a time when he said when he's doing his 35 missions with his other crew, there were 2 times he was sick and just couldn't go. You have no business up here if you have a flu or a bad cold. Well, both those times he went, the guy that took his place, both those times he had to stay, both of the guys that took his place were dead. So he said that's when I really knew what God meant. And so he finished his career as a Chief Master Sergeant in the Air Force. And like I said, we hit the 262 bases, and then later the ME-109 hit us late in April, and he did come in after us. They had a semi-suicide squadron, and their deal was just like what happened down there in Texas last week. They come in and shoot and they run out of guns, they run out of bullets, they'd come in and try to tip off your tail or something, and then drop off. Well, he came in at us, and our old outfit shot at him. He went up and made a big turn and came back, but I could see him. I stood up and looked out that window, that hatch, and there he came. But he was dead. He was hanging out that plane. But he was trying to crash into take us with him. And he missed us and hit the guy next to us, to the right of us. And he didn't take it down either. He hit the ball turret, which is about the strongest part of the plane. And the plane managed to land in Belgium. So those were the 2 fighter incidents that I had. At the very end of the war, almost the last day, our group sent a bunch of bombers all the way to Czechoslovakia, and they missed the target, so they turned around to come back. That gave the jets time to come up after them. And in 3 minutes, they shot down 4 of our planes. And one of the guys on that plane was our ball turret, my buddy, that we'd trained with. And when they were parachuted into Czechoslovakia, they were captured. A lot of them escaped, went here and went there and went there. But the plane he was on crashed right into, landed right in an SS troop training grounds. And they captured them. And they were prisoners of war. But they took them out and murdered them and buried them in a pond and put hay over it. And the bodies weren't found until almost a year after the war. And he was one of my best buddies as far as training in early training there in Sioux City, Iowa. And his wife has contacted me, and one of his cousins. But there was nothing to say except just write it up. The servants in the house that the SS troopers had told different stories, and you get it all the way down. And the co-pilot was a real fine young Texan, and his son had hunted for years, and he actually gave me part of the story. And but they just took him out and shot him, and the servants told of hearing the shots. And of course, when they buried him in the pond, everybody went, hush, hush, hush. Nobody would talk. And now they have in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, they have a ceremony each year. There's a tombstone, there's a big tombstone monument, and they have a ceremony each year to honor those 8 guys that got murdered. And they should have been free, you know. One guy says, when I wrote my first book, one of my buddies said, "Why'd you have the nerve to get back on that plane?" I said, "You didn't have a choice. You were there and you were doing it, or else." And we would, you know, once a plane, if somebody got shot down, they had a cleanup crew that run into the barracks, run into the Nissen hut, and take all their belongings out so nobody would steal them. Take them out real quick for the family. So they would eliminate the crew would just disappear. Now one of our other crew, one crew got shot down. Our other crew was in a mid-air collision. They were returning from a mission, and the guy below them came up, and I say our propeller, our third propeller, hit that B-17 and sucked the body out of the radio operator out into the nose of their plane. And then it went down. So they all died, and this body was, and when our buddies had managed to land in Belgium, and when they did, they found the extra body in the nose. Because our nose gunner had been wounded and knocked out, and et cetera, and the navigator was wounded and knocked out. And it was just the result of flying so tight together, and you have all these airwaves that the guys in front of you are creating, and you have all the smoke and dust and contrails. And I guess that guy below just lost it for a minute. But the radio operator was a twin. And his brother had also been a radio operator and also had already been killed. So the ball turret gunner, the co-pilot on this plane, on our buddy's plane, contacted these people and talked to them. And it's things like that that you just keep finding out more and more and more. And it feeds, stories feed themselves into other stories, and you begin to see connections. And people just, where do you get your stories? I say, well, families will give them to me. I've interviewed a lot of guys. I pick up some on Facebook or so. The P-51 pilot's son volunteered to give it to me. John Hill in the Battle of the Bulge on the ground volunteered to his family gave it to me. The B-17 pilot's daughter gave it to me. He went through 35 missions, or 30 missions, and went home and volunteered to be a test pilot and died in a test pilot accident. It just, you never knew what was going to happen. But you know that the 8th Air Force lost about 26,000 men and had the highest losses of any unit in the outfit in World War II. So I consider myself lucky just to be sitting here talking to you.